Over the last few hours, there's been a flurry of reports about the military situation in Ukraine. I want to stress that these are reports. There's very little confirmed information. But those reports suggest that there's been some kind of renewed Russian offensive in the area of Sverdlovsk. This is the town that is at the northernmost limb of the so-called Zelensky line, the defense line that Ukraine fell back to in the summer after the fall of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. As I remember, shortly after Lysychansk fell, officials of the Lugansk People's Republic twice, or perhaps it was three times, reported that Sverdlovsk had been captured by the Russian forces. All of those reports turned out to be wrong, and Sverdlovsk remains under Ukrainian control to this day. However, with the fall of Soledar, it's starting to look as if the Ukrainian position in Sverdlovsk is going to become increasingly complicated or difficult, and some would say unsustainable. Now, over the course of the last few hours, an official of the Donetsk People's Republic has claimed that Sverdlovsk is in what he called operational encirclement. I don't think that this means that the Russians have actually encircled Sverdlovsk. I suspect what it means is that Russian artillery is able to hit Ukrainian roads which lead into Sverdlovsk from various directions, and it does seem very likely that the Russian forces, or to be more precise, the Wagner organization forces, have managed at least possibly to cut the road and perhaps even to occupy the road linking Soledar with Sverdlovsk in the north, making it more difficult for the Ukrainians to send supplies from the south to Sverdlovsk. So that's what this commander, this Donetsk People's Militia commander, may mean when he says that Sverdlovsk is under operational encirclement. As I understand it, there's still considerable fighting going on in and around Soledar. The situation there has not been fully brought under Russian control, and that will probably take perhaps another week, and it will only be once that fighting around Sverdlovsk is completed, that Soledar is completed, that the Russians will be able to turn the full force of their fighting power against Sverdlovsk, if that is indeed what they intend to do. Now, at the outset of this video, I said that there were lots of reports about things going on around the battlefields, but again, to reiterate, reports are not the same as confirmed actions, confirmed events. And no less a person than Yevgeny Prigozhin, the erstwhile head of the Wagner organization, has now come out and discussed the situation in Klesheyevka. This is this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, which a flurry of reports yesterday was claiming had been captured by the Wagner organization forces. Well, Prigozhin has come forward and has contradicted that, and this is what he's reported to have said. Klesheyevka has not yet been taken. Heavy battles are going on. Indeed, we have had some success. As I said before, the crowds of chatterboxes running ahead of the locomotive is very bad for the guys who are losing their lives. So at the moment, a large part of Klesheyevka is under the enemy. When the units of the Wagner organization are liberated, I will inform you about this in detail. Now, that's exactly what Prigozhin said shortly before the Wagner organization forces captured Soledar. So I'm assuming that what this points to is that there is still indeed fighting going on in Klashayevka, but that there is still some Ukrainian resistance in that particular village, and that Prigozhin expects Klashayevka to be captured by the fighters of the Wagner organization at some point over the next few days. Anyway, that's a report about the situation in Klashayevka. And I would say that there's been further reports about fighting going on in other parts of the battlefronts. Now, there's also been a report about what's been going on in Marinka. Marinka is a small town, around 10,000 people before the war, located to the west, immediate west of Donetsk city. There were reports which I reported myself and discussed in earlier videos that Marinka had been captured by the Russian forces around a month to 6 weeks ago. But it turns out, again, that there's been more fighting going on, perhaps not in the center of Marinka, but certainly in its outskirts. And we've had a further discussion of this from no less a person than Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic. And this is what Pushilin is reported by the official Russian news agency TASS to have said. As for the city of Marinka, all high-rise buildings have been cleared and are controlled by our forces. We can see the achievements of our troops who are mopping up the area meter by meter. We expect Marinka to come under full control in the near future. And TASS also says that Pushilin said last week that Marinka was largely controlled by Russian forces, but Ukrainian forces had managed to gain a foothold in a residential area in the city's outskirts. In other words, in high-rise residential buildings in this part of the world, in Ukraine and in Russia, you find large, tall apartment buildings built during the period of the Soviet Union, some of them very, very strongly built. They're natural fortresses, and it turns out that the Ukrainians managed to establish themselves in some of these buildings and turn them into actual fortresses, and were continuing to resist there. And TASS then goes on to quote Pushilin as saying that he explained that the armed forces of Ukraine had been building strong defenses in Marinka for 8 years, creating numerous firing points, trenches and ditches, both along residential buildings and beneath them. And that Pushilin also noted that taking control of Marinka would open the road to Krasnogorovka, from where Ukrainian troops are shelling Donetsk. And he also said, or rather, the officials of the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, which militia, by the way, has now been incorporated in the Russian armed forces, that the militia have said that the liberation of Marinka would open the way to the capture, would put Alexandrovka and the Petrovsky and Tekstilchik districts of Donetsk city themselves out of reach of Ukrainian shelling. So it looks as if there's still been fighting going on the outskirts of Marinka, somewhat contradicting the earlier claims made about 6 weeks ago, as I said, that Marinka had been captured by the Russian forces. But Pushilin now implies that Marinka is indeed going to be under total Russian control within a short time, by which I take him to mean the next few days. So we see that fighting is continuing along the front lines. There's also been reports of a major build-up of Russian forces in the Sverdlovsk, Kremenaya area. This report is said to come from Ukrainian intelligence. The Ukrainians have been reporting this, that there's been a major Russian build-up in the Sverdlovsk, Kremenaya area, that the Ukrainians are worried that the Russians might launch some kind of attack from that kind of direction. Well, we'll see whether that does indeed happen. Now, what's going on in Kremenaya and Sverdlovsk is important. What is going on around Donetsk city is extremely important. And elsewhere, Pushilin has also said that Russian forces are now making significant progress in advancing towards Avdiivka, which is the major base of Ukrainian troops located near Donetsk city. So that is an extremely important part of the battle. But most of the fighting continues to be around Soledar and Bakhmut. And a Spanish journalist with the Spanish newspaper El País has recently been to this area, and what he's reported is enormous concentrations of Ukrainian troops, including armored vehicles, trucks, depots of every kind of equipment that Ukraine has. The entire countryside around Bakhmut is apparently saturated on the Ukrainian side with concentrations of Ukrainian troops and equipment, all trying to hold the line at Bakhmut. And what we see is that despite this enormous concentration of Ukrainian force in and around Bakhmut, the Russians continue to make progress. According to Prigozhin, they seem to be making progress in Klesheyevka. It looks as if that particular village will fall before long. A few days ago, there was definite confirmation of the Russian capture of Opitnoye. It seems that the Russians have now also entered the village of Krasnaya Gora to the north of Bakhmut and are making advances there. They've obviously captured Soledar over the last week or so, despite the fact that even as of now, Ukraine does not admit to the fall of Soledar, which is really quite extraordinary, given that this is now almost an event that took place almost a week ago, and which nobody seriously denies or disputes any longer. And the Russians have now provided photographs showing Wagner fighters in the Sol railway station to the west of Soledar. And it seems that the settlement of Sol, where this important railway station was located, that has also been captured by the Russians. So it looks as if the Russians control 3 out of the 4 main roads leading into Bakhmut, those from the south through Opitnoye, those from the east, well, they've controlled those for a long time, those from the north towards Siversk, and that all that's now left is that road leading into Bakhmut from the west, passing through Ivanovka, and according to Prigozhin, the Russians are making progress, the Wagner organization forces are making progress in Klesheyevka, which suggests that before long the Russians will be approaching the road in Ivanovka. And as I discussed in my video yesterday, when that happens, the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut will be in a cauldron. Now, that, of course, relates to the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian forces, which this journalist from El País saw, were located just west of Bakhmut. But the fact that there are so many Ukrainian troops in and around Bakhmut, thousands of them, according to this journalist from El País, well, that suggests that despite the advice that Ukraine is now getting from apparently the United States, they are not prepared to pull back from Bakhmut. There's no evidence of any Ukrainian decision to pull back from Bakhmut. On the contrary, they appear to be reinforcing here. And I have to say that, as I've discussed so many times, this does seem to me extraordinary. And I do wonder what the effect of this will be. I'm not now talking about or discussing the reasons for this strange decision. I've debated that at some time. But I do wonder whether, when the situation, this battle, develops and evolves, whether any cauldron that is going to be created is not just going to be a cauldron of the troops, the Ukrainian troops, in Bakhmut city itself, but whether gradually, as the Russians build up their forces, the intention might be eventually to encircle and engulf all of these thousands of Ukrainian troops who are located so close to Bakhmut itself. This is pure speculation on my part. I don't have the military knowledge or the information to be able to discuss that in detail, but I do wonder about this, and I do wonder what the logic of this build-up is. But I also wonder whether the Russians might see this big Ukrainian build-up in this area as some kind of opportunity. In a very recent video that he's published on YouTube, it was an interview, in fact, that he gave, Colonel McGregor spoke about how Kramatorsk, the town to the west of Bakhmut, which would presumably form the next line of defense if Bakhmut were to fall, that Kramatorsk is apparently basically undefendable. I'm not sure why Colonel McGregor thinks that, but I have to say it is something that other people with military backgrounds and with knowledge of the landscape have also said. So it may be, just maybe, that these claims about fortified lines to the west of Bakhmut in places like Kramatorsk are not really quite as realistic as some are suggesting. And it may be that this is why Ukraine is digging in and around Bakhmut, but it also, as I said, opens up, or so it seems to me, the possibility of a major Russian military operation directed at these Ukrainian forces. I'm not going to try and guess how numerous they are in and around Bakhmut once Bakhmut falls, as part of the operation to defeat the Ukrainian forces, not just in Bakhmut city itself, but around it. And whilst I'm on that topic, I would just mention something else which Colonel McGregor said, not in a recent interview, but in another interview which was published way back in December, as part of a very enlightening conversation he had with Professor Vlachos. I think I've mentioned this before, but Colonel McGregor spoke of Bakhmut, the Russians having drawn the Ukrainians into a trap in Bakhmut, drawing the Ukrainian forces there, and Bakhmut itself, the defense of Bakhmut, acting like a kind of cheese, drawing in the mice, if you like. Rather a vivid metaphor, I have to say, a disturbing one too, drawing the Ukrainian forces into defending Bakhmut, as well as Solidar, and perhaps we're looking at something rather more strategic than just the capture and defeat of the Ukrainian garrison there, and the capture of a town which, to be very clear, I do believe has strategic importance in and of itself. Anyway, that's a question that we will see, that I pose. We'll see whether events eventually answer it. We'll see what actually happens when Bakhmut does indeed fall, and what does happen to all these large numbers of Ukrainian troops that seem to be concentrated in and around it. Anyway, moving on, there has been a number of reports about events, and they're all coming, interestingly, from the Ukrainian side. Now, one of them, very interesting report, comes from a Ukrainian official, Andrei Yusov, who is described as a spokesman for the Ukrainian intelligence service. And Andrei Yusov has said that Putin has given an order to General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff of the Russian military, who is now the overall commander of Russian forces in this conflict, that Gerasimov has been ordered to liberate the territory of Donbass before March, which would mean over the course of this January and February. Now, I have no idea where Ukrainian intelligence has got this information. In my experience, the Kremlin is extremely effective at keeping its secrets. But having said that, the Kremlin's response to Yusov's comment is interesting, because when asked about it, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, simply refused. He refused outright to be drawn. He said, no, I cannot comment on it and have zero intention of doing it. Peskov could have denied the story. He could have said that Putin has given no such order, but he chose not to. Now, that may mean that such an order does exist and that the Ukrainians have got wind of it in some way. Or, alternatively, it could be that the Russians are saying to themselves, well, let's just keep the Ukrainians guessing. Let's keep the Ukrainians worried that we're planning something big in Donbass over the next few weeks. We're not actually tying ourselves down to any particular timetable. And at the same time, if the Ukrainians like to think this or want to think this, well, it plays to our advantage. It means that the Ukrainians are going to continue to reinforce their forces in Donbass, perhaps specifically in the Bakhmut area, where we can strike at them. And why would we tell them that they shouldn't be doing that by telling them that this order that they're worried about does not exist? Going back to Colonel McGregor's metaphor of a trap to catch the mice with cheese, it does look a little bit like the Russian cat playing a game with a Ukrainian mouse. Rather disturbing also, but I do wonder whether something like that may be going on. Anyway, that's the situation, as I said, on the battlefields. Lots going on, and I would just add quickly that Colonel McGregor gave some numbers for both the Russian and Ukrainian forces. He put the number of the Russian military grouping in Belarus at 100,000. Now, I'm assuming that includes the Belarusian army as well, which is said to number around 50,000. But if so, that's already significantly more than I believed. He put the total accumulation of forces, Russian forces, as I recall, in the sort of northeastern areas of Ukraine, opposite Kharkiv region in Donbass at another 100,000. He spoke about perhaps a similar number in Donbass itself and around 90,000 troops in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. A very large assembly of forces. And he also spoke, again, I may have got these figures wrong, but as I understood it, my recollection is he spoke of about 2,000 Russian tanks. And he also suggested that after the heavy losses Ukraine has suffered over the course of the fighting since the start of the autumn, that Ukrainian forces have probably declined. Now he means here combat troops, not the totality of the Ukrainian army, but combat troops, that their number may be somewhere around between 160, 170,000, as I remember. Now, that suggests a massive imbalance in the forces on either side. Right at the start of the war, and for many months afterwards, the pattern in the conflict was of the Ukrainians outnumbering the Russians on the battlefield. If the figures that Colonel Macgregor is giving are correct, and by the way, I might not be remembering them accurately, and if so, I apologize, but I'm sure I'm getting the overall picture correct. Well, we've now gone to a completely different situation where the Russians now outnumber the Ukrainians, and by a very substantial margin indeed. Now, I repeat again, I don't know how Colonel Macgregor arrives at these figures, but there's no doubt at all that he's acted as a former Pentagon official and senior military officer. He has information and is able to analyze information to a far better extent than I can do. So, huge build-up. What are the Russians going to do with it? Perhaps they're signaling to the Ukrainians that, yes, we are going to launch this great offensive, but it's going to be focused on Donbass. Our plan is to clear Donbass before March, and that might mean that the Ukrainians are going to concentrate this more limited force that they have left to Donbass, rather than perhaps attempt offensives in Zaporozhye or Svatov or Kremenaya or wherever. And if they do that, and they concentrate them perhaps in the Bakhmut region into this trap, maybe that will play to the Russians' advantage, and we could see a major Russian strike against these forces. Anyway, I accept a lot of speculation here. I'm not sure what the facts are, but I just float these ideas, and we'll see how things actually turn out on the battlefields. Now, I said there's been news from Ukraine. There's also been a very, very interesting political development in Ukraine, which is that President Zelensky's spin doctor, Alexei Arestovich, an individual who has been presenting the Ukrainian case throughout the war and been providing almost daily commentary on the events on the battlefields, he's now been sacked. And it seems that in the hours before he was sacked, he also wrote a resignation letter. Now, the purported explanation for all of this is an event that took place a few days ago during the last big Russian missile strike. Now, you will no doubt remember from my previous video, those who follow me will no doubt remember that over the course of that missile strike, there was a major explosion, there was a major detonation in a residential apartment building in the city of Dnipro. And there were reports initially that it had been caused by a Kh-22 supersonic Russian cruise missile crashing into this building. It's another example of the Russians using inaccurate, unreliable missiles to attack which ended up in the attack of residential buildings. Well, I'm going to say first of all that I've been getting lots of commentary about this from various people, and Arestovich came out with a statement saying that what actually happened was that Ukrainian air defense tried to intercept this Kh-22 cruise missile, and that caused it to change its trajectory and land into this building. And he was criticized for saying that by the Ukrainian Air Defense Command, who blurted out the fact along the way that they can't actually intercept Kh-22 missiles. They don't have the capability to do that. But anyway, there was a storm. There were demands for Arestovich's dismissal, that he'd somehow what he'd said meant that people were no longer blaming the Russians for what happened at this building, that he'd passed the responsibility to the Ukrainians. And this is what supposedly, this outcry over this affair is what supposedly has led to Arestovich's resignation. Now, before I discuss that, I just wanted to say I've had a lot of people commenting about this event, and I'm going to say that I myself have now started to change my views about this. The first thing to say is a number of people have made the point that if a Kh-22 missile had indeed struck an apartment building in Dnipro, the damage that would have been done would have been much, much greater given the size of this cruise missile, and that anyway, the nature of the Kh-22 is that there would be telltale signs, like, sonic booms and things of that kind, which were not in evidence when this missile struck this building, and that makes it extremely unlikely that it was in fact a Kh-22 that struck this building. In fact, some commentators have ruled out that possibility altogether. And, well, there are lots of other Russian missiles. Perhaps it was a subsonic Kh-101 or a Calibre, but the Ukrainians have all denied that it was such a missile, such a Russian missile. So that perhaps brings us back to the theory that it was a Ukrainian air defense missile, perhaps an S-300, missing its target and landing on a Ukrainian residential building, as unfortunately has happened rather often over the course of this war. The Russians, by the way, have said emphatically that none of their missiles, in fact, impacted on this residential building, which would suggest that they're basically pointing at a Ukrainian missile as having done this damage. Well, I'm not going to discuss this further. I mean, I'm not in a position to say what happened with this building, what kind of a missile it was. I just pass on this information. The one thing I would say is that it makes absolutely no sense to me that the Russians would deliberately attack an apartment building in Dnipro. What would they achieve by doing so? And in that respect, attempts to suggest that this incident was some sort of Russian war crime are surely wrong. But let's come back to Arestovich, because Arestovich is now definitely dismissed. Now, anybody who's been following this war will know how central Arestovich has been to the Ukrainian media, public relations, propaganda machine, call it whatever you like. And there's been lots of opinions about Arestovich. Many people deride him as a sort of Baghdad Bob figure, person who makes up all sorts of fantastic claims, is in denial about key events. What he says is so far-fetched and ridiculous that is not to be taken seriously. I have consistently taken him more seriously, and I think people who have been following my programs will have noticed this. I think in some respects he was actually quite an effective spin doctor. Undoubtedly, much of what he was saying was wrong. If you looked to Arestovich and expected him to be a reliable source, well, you were deluding yourself. There was nothing reliable about Arestovich's accounts of what was happening. But against that, he was, in my opinion, an effective communicator, and he did, to a surprising degree, manage to control the narrative of the war, both within Ukraine itself and perhaps more importantly, in sections of the Western media. So I would have said overall that he was an important asset for the Ukrainian government, not a liability, as Baghdad Bob undoubtedly became to Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq. So getting rid of this, I think, rather effective operator, I appreciate there'll be some people who won't agree with me, but getting rid of this rather effective operator, effectively admitting that his versions of events are not always true. And bear in mind, he apparently tried to resign, but he's actually been dismissed, despite apparently having a historically close relationship to Zelensky, one which has had its rocky moments, it has to be said. He did apparently attempt to resign roughly a year ago. Well, getting rid of Zelensky at this time, during this conflict, I have to say, to me, it is a bad sign for Ukraine. It does suggest that there is growing unease, concern, probably acrimony taking place within the Ukrainian leadership. Now, maybe from a Ukrainian point of view, Arestovich coming forward and diluting claims that the Russians bore exclusive responsibility for the missile strike on the Dnipro apartment, well, maybe from a Ukrainian point of view, that was a mistake, or even an unjustifiable mistake. But I can't help but think that it's looked at over the entire context of this war, a relatively minor episode. If Arestovich was still in good standing with the Ukrainian authorities, with Zelensky and Zelensky and all of those, I would have thought that he'd have been able to survive something like that. The fact that he was basically slung out suggests that things are not going well and that they no longer feel confident in Arestovich's handling of the media operation, which also, to my mind, suggests that they're worried that that media operation is no longer able any longer to cloak the reality of the deteriorating situation on the battlefields. There's also an even more tantalizing possibility, which is that why did Arestovich come forward and say that Ukrainian air defense might have played a role in this event at this apartment building, Might he have done it because he was himself looking for a way out, that he was trying in effect to modify the story, but knew that there would be a reaction, and that he basically set the scene so that he could find some means or justification to quit? There are reports in the Russian media, by the way, that Aristovich's dismissal is only going to be the start of some sort of purge within the Ukrainian leadership. Well, that may be true or it may be false. We'll just have to wait and see. But I can't help but think that Aristovich's removal and the inability of the Ukrainian leadership to concede the undoubted fact that Solidar has been captured by the Russians all point to a crisis within Ukraine's, shall we say, public relations campaign in the war. And that also in turn points to a more general crisis of confidence about the course of the war on the part of the Ukrainian government. Well, again, perhaps I'm putting together the pieces wrongly, but certainly given how important a public face Arestovich has been for Ukraine over the course of the last 11 months, I do think that his departure and the rather strange circumstances of it are consequential. Now, having said all of this, there's a number of other things I'm going to briefly cover over the course of this program. The first is that Bloomberg, having told us about the fact that Russian oil production or oil exports have collapsed by 54% in December, that Russian industry is only being propped up by increases in military production, which is unsustainable, that, all sorts of other things about the Russian economy, all leading to the conclusion that some sort of deep crisis is underway there. They've now come forward and admitted that over the course of the last week, Russian oil exports were at their highest level since April. And they seem to be admitting or conceding, finally, that the Russians have brushed off or shrugged off the EU's oil sanctions. Just mentioning this, I've said previously that Bloomberg's reporting on the state of the Russian economy has become increasingly eccentric, but it does seem that they finally faced reality as the data has become increasingly difficult to argue with. But it isn't just Bloomberg, because we're now also getting accounts of the situation on Russia's home front. And I'm going to say that there's been an interesting article which has now appeared by a gentleman called Jonathan Esther in a magazine called The Conversation. And I'd like to say again that I've become aware of this, a gentleman called Alexander Titov. Mr. Esther is the editor of this publication, The Conversation, but Alexander Titov, who clearly has a Russian background from this, given his name, but who is a lecturer in modern European history at Queen's University, Belfast. Anyway, he's just been to Moscow and he's published an article. And as I said, I should say that I've become aware of this article because it's been circulated by the historian Geoffrey Roberts, and I am one of those people privileged to receive Geoffrey Roberts's circular emails in which he provides attachments to interesting articles about this conflict. And this is what Mr. Titov says. He says, it's been a year since I last visited Russia, and so I was curious to see how attitudes had changed since then. Equally important was to see for myself how the war has changed life in Russia. And then he goes on to say this. The first surprise was how normal life was. Despite all the media reports of doom and gloom as a result of Western sanctions, everything works just as before. Domestic banking is working, salaries and pensions are paid on time, ubiquitous e-commerce is bustling with activity, the shops are stuffed with food and consumer goods. In St. Petersburg, at least, I've struggled to notice any change in daily life compared to January 2021. He then goes on to say that digging deeper, the impact of sanctions is there. One issue that kept popping up was spare car parts, which have become noticeably more expensive. But even there, new supplies are being shipped now. This goes pretty much for everything else consumer-oriented. There's no shortages, even of Western goods, such as whiskey. The supermarket shelves are fully stocked, and he's provided photographs. He's then provided a photograph of a supermarket in St. Petersburg, and indeed one does see lots of pictures of all sorts of whiskey brands that I'm familiar with. The famous Grouse is there, Grant's is there, Johnny Walker is there. They're all there apparently. And then he goes on to say EU travel restrictions have had their effect, but nothing like the measures introduced during the pandemic. People can still travel to many countries, including Turkey, Egypt, or the Gulf states. And business people complain of facing difficulties, particularly those in the import-export center. But after a few months of chaos, business has been finding new shipping routes via third countries such as Turkey or Kazakhstan. An acquaintance who works in a defense-related sector laughed at the suggestion that Russia could run out of missiles. He told me the defense industry has been stockpiling essential parts for years and is also using more locally sourced alternatives, although this is a claim I am unable to verify, well, for obvious reasons. The rest can still be bought albeit at inflated prices. Their real problem is not a lack of parts, but the capacity to scale up production to meet growing military orders. So they have all the parts they need, they just lack the factory space, which, by the way, is probably being expanded. And then Mr. Titov goes on to say, the general impression from conversations with people in different businesses is that their main focus is on adapting to the new normal. Many things will be less efficient and more expensive, but the Russian economy will not collapse. If this is a crisis for Russia, and then Titov says that it is, I don't see how, based on his own reporting. But anyway, he goes on to say it's nothing like the turmoil of the early 1990s when the state, society and economy were all collapsing at the same time. And he then discusses at very considerable length the mood in Russian society. He says that there is very much a peacetime feeling about the mood in Russia, and that people don't particularly want to talk about the war. And this is made him conclude that the topic of the war is not one that most Russians are keen to discuss. I'm going to say straight away that I strongly suspect that this is wrong. I follow Russian media, I read Russian Telegram channels. I get the impression, contrary to Mr. Titov's impression, that in fact the Russian public is extremely interested in the war and is following military developments very closely. And if you look at Russian opinion polls, you see that though President Putin's popularity rating remains consistently high, it does rise and dip with almost precise correlation to the progress, apparent progress or lack of it, over the course of the war. I suspect that it's more a case of people being reluctant to talk about the war with somebody like Mr. Titov, who's just come from the West, even though, as I said, it does seem as if he probably has a Russian background. But anyway, he then finishes this interesting article by saying the following: "My distinct impression from 2 weeks in St. Petersburg is that Russia's society and economy is still nowhere near to being fully mobilized for the war effort." I'm sure that's true, by the way. I'm sure that there's an awful lot more that the Russians could do and will do if they're pushed. For the moment, I suspect that the calculation is that they've done enough. He then goes on to say, while the partial mobilization in September and October last year brought the war closer to home, it involved a relatively small percentage of the population. From all of my acquaintances, only one friend of a friend was called up. And he goes on to say that barring huge military setbacks leading to a really extensive mobilization, it appears that life on Russia's home front is carrying on fairly normally. And he then says, and this is perhaps the most interesting part of the article, one of the biggest lessons from my trip is the huge gap between representations of Russia in the West and what you see when you arrive there. The gap in perception is likely to increase because of the lack of people currently traveling there from the West and the suspension of professional and academic links. Important as they are, reliance on comment from anti-Putin activists in exile or those remaining in Russia and still active on social media won't help, as they're marginalized at home and lose contact with Russian reality while abroad. The fact is, there is no substitute for seeing things for yourself. I found my recent trip to Russia stressful, but I'm glad I did it. Now, I have to say, this is consistent with everything that I am hearing, that in fact, the economy has shrugged off the sanctions, that the Russian economy has continued to function successfully, that there's no crisis in military production. In fact, all the indications are that military production is being cranked up, and that there are no shortages of consumer goods, and that there's certainly no shortages of food, and that financial stresses, such as one might expect in a crisis situation, expressing themselves, for example, in much higher inflation, that financial stresses do not exist. That article that appeared a short time ago in Bloomberg that implied that it was only unsustainable increases in military production that were propping up the entire Russian industrial economy is wrong. And I think that reporting of the situation on the ground essentially confirms that. Now, that brings me back to that fascinating interview by the French sociologist Emmanuel Todd that I discussed I think 2 programs ago, or at any rate very recently. And Todd makes the point that in reporting about the war, there is this assumption that the outcome of the war is of existential importance to the Russians, but to no one else. certainly not to the West. And Todd, who has a much more keen understanding both of the global perceptions of this war and of the economic aspects of the war than is common amongst, well, far too many Western commentators, says outright that this is wrong. Now, again, I'm relying here on the translation of Emmanuel Todd's interview that I've been provided by a viewer, but this is what he says, and I think it's important, and I'm going to read out these comments in full. And he first of all talks about John Mearsheimer, the American academic and realist and writer on international relations, and Todd agrees with him on many things, but then he goes on to say that Mearsheimer, like a good American, overestimates his country. He considers that if for the Russians the war in Ukraine is existential, for the Americans it is basically only one game of power amongst others. After Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, one debacle more or less, whatever. The basic axiom of American geopolitics is we can do whatever we want because we're sheltered in the distance between two oceans. Nothing will ever happen to us. Nothing would be existential for America. Insufficiency of analysis, which today leads Biden to a headlong rush. In other words, Biden thinks this, the entire American political class thinks this. They don't see this conflict in Ukraine as existential for the United States. It's existential for the Russians. Everybody accepts this, but it's not existential for the United States, and which is why the United States has blundered into this conflict, or not blundered, why it's found itself in this conflict and is acting in the way that it is, but that is actually wrong, that this was a major miscalculation made right at the outset. And Todd goes on to say, America is fragile. The resistance of the Russian economy is pushing the American imperial system towards the precipice. Nobody had foreseen that the Russian economy would hold up against the economic power of NATO. Well, I'm going to say, not quite true that nobody did. I did say back in February that the Russians would withstand the sanctions. And at the Duran, we were very isolated in that view. Most people expected that the sanctions would be devastating. We thought that the Russians would come through. Having said that, even I, as I'm the first to admit, did not expect that they would come through so painlessly as they have. But anyway, moving on from that, Todd then goes on to say, if the Russian economy resists the sanctions indefinitely and manages to exhaust the European economy, whilst it itself continues to be backed by China, then American monetary and financial controls of the world will collapse, and with them the possibility for the United States to fund their huge trade deficit for nothing by, in effect, in other words, printing dollars or borrowing in dollars, American dollars, from the rest of the world. This, therefore, has become existential for the United States. No more than Russia, they cannot withdraw from the conflict. They cannot let go. This is why we're now in an endless war, in a confrontation whose outcome must be the collapse of one or the other. Chinese, Indians, and Saudis, amongst others, are jubilant. Now, I think Todd overstates the case. I don't think that failure in Ukraine is going to result in the immediate collapse of the dollar-based global financial system. I don't think we should fall into the trap of thinking it in quite that way. But as I have said before, if the Russians are able to withstand the sanctions shock and come through it unscathed, as all the indications are that they are doing, then the Russians will have exposed the most powerful instrument that the United States and the Western powers have in their arsenal in order to coerce other countries to follow their line, which is sanctions, that instrument is losing its effect. Obviously, there are things about Russia which make Russia more resistant to sanctions than other countries. But then again, as Todd correctly says, that was not the widespread assumption when the sanctions were first imposed. And whilst I don't think that this will cause an immediate crisis in the world system, I think over time, and I'm not talking about a long time, I think the effect of the Russians pulling through and emerging from the sanctions war unscathed and intact, and with an economy that's increasingly resilient and self-sufficient and reoriented towards other trading partners, well, that is going to have a major effect on international relations, including international economic relations. And of course, if there is a Russian military victory in Ukraine, as I have no doubt there will be, well, that is going to have an even bigger effect on the international standing of the United States. And we've seen two articles just coming up which lead to the conclusion that the Russians will come out of the sanctions war intact. Firstly, that Bloomberg article, the Russians are not finding any problems in exporting their oil. Their oil exports, their seaborne oil exports, are now back to April levels. And we also see from Mr. Titov's experiences in St. Petersburg that the shops are full, e-commerce is buzzing, there's no obvious shortages, even spare parts for cars, which for a time were difficult to come by, are now becoming available, and that military production, far from becoming exhausted or running out of missiles or anything of that kind, that's able to keep going and keep going almost indefinitely, and that in fact capacity issues are the only problem, and no doubt those capacity issues will be resolved as the war continues. So we come back to that fundamental mistake that was made a year ago. A year ago, the Russians suggested a compromise. They proposed to the Western powers to draft treaties to try to stabilize the political situation in Europe, the strategic situation in Europe. They tried to basically talk the United States out of whatever long-term and indeed short-term plans in Ukraine that the United States had. And of course, they found that the United States was not in any way accommodating. Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, the man who used to read the Daily Brief to the President of the United States himself, Ronald Reagan, and I believe George H.W. Bush, he's pointed out that in a readout, the Kremlin said that President Biden, over the course of a conversation that took place about a year ago, told Putin that the United States had no intention of establishing missiles in Ukraine. And the Russians appeared to see that as a possible basis for further talks. But that when, a short time later, the Russians, after that conversation, followed up by trying to enter into substantive negotiations on that very issue with the Americans, they discovered that Biden's words had absolutely no meaning and that the United States was not prepared to enter into any sort of commitments about the deployment of missiles in Ukraine. And Ray McGovern says that this was perhaps one of the key moments when the Russians decided that the only way forward was for them to take the action that they did over the next few weeks in Ukraine. So, think about that. The United States took all of these measures. They looked the other way as it seems Ukraine started to intensify its shelling in Donbass. They refused outright to discuss the question of Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. They hid behind this non-existent principle that any country that wanted to join NATO had a right to do so. As I said, that principle does not exist, and there is no glimmer of it anywhere in the Washington Treaty, but we were constantly told in every media outlet in the West and from every government official that I can remember that this was a fundamental principle that could not be compromised in any way. Wasn't true, but that was what they said. Well, look where it's led. Look what people like Todd are saying, and as I said, in full agreement with him there. It's led the West, it's led the United States into a confrontation with the Russians. And it's a military confrontation on the Ukrainian battlefields. And as I've discussed in this program and many other programs, and many others, Colonel McGregor, Brian Beletic, Scott Ritter, all sorts of people have discussed that military confrontation on the Ukrainian battlefields is not going well, and things are going from bad to worse. And that's something I will turn to again in my next video. But on top of that, there's been this overarching economic conflict, this attempt to use the sanctions weapon to break Russia, break it once and for all. And what has happened is that the United States, its jaw has closed and it's breaking its teeth. Maybe not quite existential, or if you prefer, existential for the American empire, for the American global position, for the grandiose ambitions of the neocons and of their allies in the American deep state. Perhaps not existential for the United States as a country, but nonetheless, surely not what the United States had planned. Well, there we go. War is a very unpredictable thing. It's not something one should ever enter into lightly. The United States entered far too lightly into this conflict. It didn't think it through. It overestimated the sanctions that it would impose on Russia. It underestimated the blowback it would have on the European and global economy. It misunderstood the way in which the war itself would play out, and it finds itself in the crisis that Emmanuel Todd has so well discussed. Well, that's where I stop for today. Another long video. Just to remind you again, all our videos can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also should also check out our shop, Look at the great things that you will find there. Our mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Thank you for joining me, and more from me soon.